that's part of what stuck out to me from the Brandeis Center when I would read statements. I thought nobody else has to pay such a high price to be accepted. And those people who are strong enough to stand up to it find themselves alienated and isolated.
Welcome to What Came After. I'm your host, Manya Marcus. On What Came After, we'll take a look at the many ways people's lives have changed since the brutal massacre in Israel on October 7th, 2023. We'll be speaking to people around the world to learn how this profound moment in Jewish and global history continues to shift, shape, and change them. To learn more, please visit us at whatcameafter.com. It is September 3rd, 2025, and I'm sitting here with Deena Margulies. Why don't you tell me a little bit about where we are and what it is that you do here?
Sure. So right now we're actually in the Brandeis Center's New York office, where we've been a year yesterday. When I first started at the Brandeis Center, we had an office in Washington, D.C., and since I've joined in 2022, we have grown substantially. I'm sure it comes as no surprise that since October 7th and the uptick of antisemitism on college campuses, in schools, and through America, we've been very busy. I find myself now surrounded by a team of attorneys, most of whom in this office were hired in the past year.
Wow. And are you moving offices?
Yes, at some point we're moving to a more permanent location.
Something that can house
the robust growth of the Brandeis Center.
And what does the Brandeis Center focus on?
The Brandeis Center was founded by Ken Marcus many years ago, over a decade. And he was the former director of Office for Civil Rights under the previous Trump administration. We say that our mission is obviously to advance the rights of all people, but we've certainly been focused on anti-Semitism, both on college campuses and in public schools and in the workplace. What makes the Brandeis Center unique is our approach to handling it. We deal directly with students, and we also want to make sure that students, parents, everybody who comes to us is informed and understands Title VI, understands their legal rights, protections, understands for most Jews, Zionism is integral to their Jewish identity, so that when Jewish students are alienated or ostracized or marginalized or harassed on the basis of the Zionist component of their identity, where somebody says, we don't want to deal with Zionists or no dirty Zios or things like that, they're being targeted on the basis of their Jewish identity.
I'd love you to give us a very brief primer on what Title VI is.
So Title VI is part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. What's interesting about Title VI is when it was written in 1964, it protects people on race, color, and national origin. It's been expanded actually under the Marcus Doctrine, under Ken Marcus, and it applies to any entity, whether it be a K through 12 school or a university or college that takes federal funds, which most do, even private universities. And it protects students from discrimination or harassment based on their identity, in this case, their Jewish ethnicity. One of the things that is important about Title VI is schools have an obligation to address a hostile environment if there is one on a college campus or even in a school. And a hostile environment is defined under Title VI as any kind of harassment that is pervasive or severe that interferes with an individual's ability to obtain any educational benefit. On a college campus, that could mean going to the dining hall, joining a student organization, walking freely to the campus, going to the library unobstructed and without protesters blocking you or asking you for a bracelet like at UCLA. And I have found, at least during my time here, not many people are aware of the rights and protections that they have under Title VI and understand what a hostile environment is. And often students don't even understand that they're being discriminated against. They've been gaslit so often by administrators at universities that they don't realize what is happening to them is wrong and that they are being treated differently than other students.
Now, how does your work here distinguish between protections of free speech versus protections of Title VI? How does that line get navigated?
We take the First Amendment very seriously at the Brandeis Center, and we are very quick to distinguish between speech and conduct. We recognize that hate speech is protected under the First Amendment, and people can say all kinds of vile anti-Semitic things. It's not prohibited. But if that is repeated and pervasive and severe and interferes with a individual's ability to obtain an education. That's a distinction. And I think it's important to distinguish between conduct and speech. For example, a lot of times a student will say, they said from the river to the sea, or there was posters that hung that said from the river to the sea, and we'll explain to them why that's speech, which is different from a student saying to me, I walked past the encampment and somebody screamed at me and said, "So Zionists allowed, you can't come into this section, you can't cross through here." That's conduct. The other thing is that we often will find that the people are often excluded from things, like you can't join this group because you're a Zionist. That's not speech.
Right, of course.
But we take the First Amendment very seriously at the Brandeis Center, and in no way do we look to inhibit any speech. And a good example of this is we often have gotten complaints from Jewish students and their parents when an anti-Semitic speaker is brought to campus. So I don't know if you're familiar with Mohammed El-Kurd, who is a young, I guess he considers himself to be a Palestinian poet, but what he spreads is blood libel and all kinds of anti-Semitic tropes. And he basically spreads anti-Semitism wherever he goes. And students will say, we don't want him on our campus. And our response is always not to shut him down, but for the school to use its voice to show moral clarity and to speak out in advance of him coming and to say, we don't condone what Mohammed El-Kurd has said. We don't condone the following things, and also explain why it's anti-Semitic and explain why it's hurtful. We feel that more speech is better than less speech.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
There was an interview with John McWhorter, a professor at Columbia. He typically will play his students this piece by John Cage, and it's 3 minutes and 29 seconds of silence. The audience finds out at the end that they've been listening to themselves. So he usually plays this at the end of the spring semester, quote unquote, plays this at the end of the spring semester for his students. And he gave an interview explaining why he didn't do it this year, which was because he didn't want to subject Jewish students in the class to open windows with screaming of Free Palestine, from the river to the sea, globalize the Intifada. I think probably most insidiously is that slogan. And I will tell you that I had a reaction that it's not only Jewish students who need to be protected from that kind of interrupted, caustic, dominated learning environment. Is that something that makes sense to you, that it's other students who can't think and be critical when there's so much noise and repetition? It feels like it would be very hard even for non-Jewish students to learn in that kind of environment.
Yes, and we see this all the time. Even with the Columbia encampment, it impacted non-Jewish students as well, especially those non-Jewish students who didn't want to take part, who didn't agree with the encampment, or just wanted to go about their day. And the other part of Title VI that I should talk about is that it also protects people who are perceived as. We often will get students who are not Jewish. I have one at a school who goes to Hillel. You know, she likes the Shabbat dinner.
And she's not Jewish.
And she's not Jewish. And she says, I always feel welcome here. And she wears one of the hostage pins and the dog tags. And she started facing real anti-Semitism at the school. People started excluding her. They started calling her all kinds of anti-Semitic names. And she is also protected under Title VI as perceived as. Sometimes also students who are not perceived as, but who form friendships with Jewish students, who stand in alliance with them, often, like especially at small schools, get targeted. And that's also really important because without allies, we are isolated and alienated. We want other people to stand with us, and we want those protections for them as well.
And so you do legal work on the behalves of?
For people, yeah, I've had people who have come to me who have stood up and done the right thing. I had a student 2 years ago at Rice University who took a stand. It was like a DEI initiative that was really supposed to sort of help students understand inclusivity. And they felt that the first thing they should do was endorse BDS. And a non-Jewish student said, well, how does that promote inclusivity if you're saying that we should boycott an entire country and those people who support that country because they are part of that country, right? How is that inclusive? And he was essentially forced out of the organization for standing by his Jewish friends.
And he came to you?
Yeah, he came to me through a friend. And sometimes those are actually, for me, the most moving intakes that I do because I'm so in awe of these young people who are willing to take a stand knowing, especially at that age, your social life is so important to you and you're in this sort of bubble of a university or college world. And taking a stand like that and then finding that half of your friends ghost you, it's often the silence that they're met with by the other side, that they just don't want to engage with them anymore.
Right.
is so hurtful.
Yeah, that is very moving when somebody would make that choice in that environment. So you have been working with the Brandeis Center, which is different than the university. I just want to state that. What is the full name of this organization?
It's the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law.
So making that distinction. You have been here since the end of 2022. That's very interesting to me because it indicates that you were not brought in by October 7th. This was a professional decision that you made prior to that.
I did.
You were doing a very different kind of work prior to this. Could you tell us a little bit about your professional trajectory and why you landed here?
When I went to law school, my focus was mainly on entertainment law, and I have an LLM in intellectual property, and I practice both intellectual property and telecommunications. I worked for 2 FCC commissioners. I've always cared as a Jew who was bat mitzvahed, was raised in the temple. It's always been important to me, this concept of never again, that if anything were to happen in this country, I wouldn't just sit idly by. I was living in Washington, D.C. about 10 years ago, and I lived very close to the Israeli embassy, and I always jog. I'm a morning jogger. I had decided to take my jog later in the morning, and I came by a protest in front of the Israeli embassy. It was mainly students from American University, and they had signs for boycott, divest, and sanction, and they were accusing Israel of genocide, and this was the first time I had ever heard that. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was mystified by this. And I started to ask questions to the students, and I found that they didn't really want to discuss it. They wanted to just tell me that if I didn't agree with it, that I myself was a racist. And I explained to them what it meant to be Jewish. And then I found that there were students there who said to me, no, I'm Jewish too, and you just don't know. And I was horrified. And that set me on a course of reading up everything I could and starting to read publications like J&S and the Algemeiner and really opening up my eyes as to what was happening. And also doing a deeper dive on certain people's positions that I had never been aware of prior to that. I went a little more into the obsessed category where I started to closely read the New York Times, post comments, because I was so disheartened to find I'm a Jewish New Yorker. I was born in Brooklyn, and I've always considered this one of the epicenters for Jewish life. And I couldn't believe, and now it seems so naive, that the New York Times could be anti-Semitic and that they could be publishing things that were not true. My family became concerned because I was so consumed with it and so upset. And I actually had a conversation with a Chabad rabbi who said to me, you should get involved in this. You'll feel better if you know you're doing something. I don't think posting comments to the New York Times and the Washington Post and so forth is helpful to you. And so I started to look at a number of different Jewish organizations, and I loved what the Brandeis Center was doing. And I had sent in an application, and I heard that they weren't hiring. And this is a true story. My younger sister found Ken Marcus on LinkedIn and wrote him an email about the fact that she thought I'd be really good for this position at the Brandeis Center and just to talk to me. And he did. We talked for over an hour, and we talked about the IHRA definition, and that led to another interview, and then I met the rest of the team.
What is the IHRA definition?
The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of antisemitism. And while it's not a perfect definition, we feel it's the best definition we have, especially the examples that follow.
Can you share with us what that definition is?
In my humble opinion, what makes the IHRA definition stand out are the 3 Ds, that if you demonize, double standard, or delegitimize the state of Israel, if you hold it to a standard that you hold no other country, if you demonize it in a way that you don't do any other country. It says right there, you can criticize Israel's government, just like we criticize America's government, just like we criticize our leaders. But nobody goes and says that America doesn't have a right to exist, or that other countries don't have a right to exist, and that Jewish people have a right to self-determination. I thought when I first read the IHRA definition, this makes sense to me. This would be so helpful if more people embrace this definition and even read the definition. I have found that when you say it, people say it restricts speech. And I think, no, it doesn't restrict speech. First of all, anti-Semitic speech is still protected speech. But more than that, I think it explains why things are anti-Semitic and leads to further discussion so people can understand and why they either delegitimize, demonize, or hold Israel to a double standard. And it also talks about certain things like Jewish tropes, blaming Jews for the ills of society. And I thought, this is such an important definition. It's interesting because we had 2 non-Jewish attorneys who were involved in a settlement with us, and they were going to ask this university to consider the IHRA definition. there's always pushback. And they said to us, what is the pushback? We don't understand. And I thought that's so interesting because I think a lot of people jump to the conclusion when they hear the name, like you say IHRA definition, and people get up in arms, but they often don't take the time to read it.
So these were attorneys on the opposing side?
No, this is outside counsel and one of our attorneys. Not all the attorneys who work for Brandeis Center are Jewish.
Okay. And they were surprised that there's this vitriolic reaction to this definition when it actually really does.
I hope they don't kill me for telling this story, but I thought it said a lot. If people literally just read the definition, maybe they wouldn't object so much. Maybe it just has become a thing that people object to before they even give it consideration.
You mentioned that your day ended at 11:30 last night and began at 4 a.m. How has your family adjusted to this? Because, I'm noting that they felt you were pulled away from them by your preoccupation with the antisemitism that was going on prior to October 7th. And then you found this outlet at the behest of a rabbi. And now I'm sure your family is feeling that you're far away again.
They do.
How are you navigating that right now?
It's a good question, and I don't navigate it perfectly. I feel very committed to this position, and it's personal for me in a way that none of my other positions were, and it's so meaningful. And I do want to say that for the first time, the New York Times and the things that I read and the anti-Semitic comments that I hear don't upset me in the same way, because I feel that I'm doing what I can, and I'm working for an organization with wonderful people, and it's a privilege to work with them. For me, this is B'Sher, like I'm in the right place for myself. But I will say that there are times where my family will say to me, you need to scale back on the weekends and take some time because you're burning out. You need to walk away from this. And you do. You do. I do take Shabbat and I don't work on Saturday. And I wasn't a Shabbat observer, but I do feel like I need to step away and to take back aspects of my life so that I can be better for this. Because like last night where I got home and I knew I had a meeting and I knew it was important and I wanted to be on the call. I mean, I'm also older, so you have to say to yourself, I can do this for a few days and then I'll probably crash on Friday afternoon. And that's why I'm excited that it'll start getting darker soon and that Friday there'll be sundown earlier. Yeah.
And your clock will shift. There's been a little bit of discussion about moral injury. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, but it sort of looks at how soldiers or healthcare workers, anyone who is put in a position of actually doing noble work is often stricken with a feeling of, I didn't do enough, or maybe in the heat of the moment, I didn't do exactly the right thing. When you talk about the urgency with which you approach these meetings, I'm assuming for people who are in great distress, does that sense of moral injury ever come for you, that I'm not doing enough, that I haven't done enough, I can't do enough?
Yes. It's been a long time since I was a student, and the college experience that I had at UPenn is very different than the experience that Jewish students are having at UPenn. And I bring this up because it was the first case I filed an OCR complaint for, and it was my alma mater. I felt a sense of urgency when I heard from fellow Penn students that they were hearing they should go back to Minsk in front of Van Pelt Library. I felt a sense of, you have to help them. You know what this would feel like for you if this was happening,
and
right?
You can imagine yourself in that place.
Yes.
Very personal for you.
Yeah. And what happened at Columbia and Barnard was personal for me. My sister went to Barnard, and I kept thinking, if she were one of those students, right, who was in the building when they took over the library, I'd be sick. And I do. I feel a responsibility for these students. And I also feel that it's not easy for them to come forward. When you're that age and this generation, I do think it's really hard. I find that sometimes the students will say in a meeting, like, this is confidential, right? You're not going to tell anybody. And I say to them, no, this is going to stay confidential within the Brandeis Center. I mean, I'm not your attorney, but this is a meeting and I'm here to listen. But they're so afraid that somebody's going to know that, God forbid, they went and talked to somebody about their experience, that somehow they're not going to fit in school if they question what's happening. Sometimes I've had people who will say to me, like, I need to meet with you tomorrow. And I'm like, okay, but I don't have any availability tomorrow.
The time doesn't exist.
And I get it that sometimes in California, they'll say to me, I'm done with class at 6. So can we meet at 7 my time? And I'm thinking, that's 10. And I'm not great at 10 o'clock at night if I start this early. Like, I'm not at my best.
Right. I can imagine.
So let's find a different day. And, I understand there's a sense of urgency, but I also want to make sure I'm the best Deena that you can get for this meeting. And the other thing that we do that I really love at Brandeis is we bring on law clerks who come every semester, and we train them and they sit in on the meetings and take notes. And then afterwards, you'll ask them to stay on for a few minutes and you debrief and learn. And I've had so many that after their time write me some of the most moving emails saying to me, like, I learned more from you than I learned in law school. And I learned so much being on these calls. And I want to do this. And I think, oh my gosh, we're shaping another generation of attorneys. And now I do. I feel like an obligation that they should understand what to do. When I was in law school, it was you went to a big firm or you went to the government and nobody really talked about like the human toll of it, right? And I feel like that's what makes the Brandeis Center so special. Because we do want students to feel heard. And look, there are people who come to me and there's no case. It's speech. But I explain to them why it's speech. And I explain to them what is not speech. And I educate them. And at least they leave and I feel like they understand the tools that they have in their toolbox to go forward. And sometimes these students come back to me and they're like, wait, I think I have an incident or I have a friend who might. And at least they don't leave feeling like
totally discouraged. They wasted their time. Right.
Yes.
Exactly. So there's this contrasting, you're describing that the Brandeis Center moves the needle in a micro way with each individual case, but also a macro way because you train law clerks and they will go out and do this work and has this domino effect and impact. Does that occur to you when you train law students that you might be having even additional reach than when you work with clients?
I never thought of it that way. I've had some of them come to me and say, I'm thinking I'd rather do this than go forward in what I was planning on doing. Or even if they do stay on their career path, they consider Title VI and they consider what it means to be discriminated against. So even going forward as another Jewish attorney, right? Like they understand their rights and what to look for. And I've had so many of them stay in touch with me. I've had students who we've represented in complaints stay in touch. And I'm always happy to see that they're doing well. We got over the hump that they had. One of the earliest cases that I had was at American University, and we filed a public complaint. It's available on our website. And I met a young man who I'm still so in awe of, young Israeli on that campus who was just harassed beyond belief. He was spit on. He had a poster for his piano concert and they blacked out his eyes and said Hitler should have finished. It was beyond disgusting.
What year was this?
This was right after October 7th. So this was 2023. And when I met him, I had a number of students who put us in touch and he was like shut down and he was angry and scared. And I said to him, we can file a complaint. And we did. And we described his situation. And in the process of doing this, I feel he found his voice and he ended up becoming part of student government in his last year. He's graduated now and he's a brilliant young man. And he did press for the complaint. And I think having somebody listen and hear his story and validate, and also knowing that there was a bunch of other Jewish students in that community who supported him, I feel like it's a privilege to know some of, many of these students and see what they go through and follow them through the fruition of, you file the complaint and maybe because of TV, people think, oh, well, we filed it. So now what? We're going to be in court tomorrow because they see it on TV. You know what I mean? Or it's obviously very slow, whether you file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education or in a governmental agency, or you actually file in court. Any of these ways, it doesn't move quickly. And just because you file, right, and you do some press doesn't mean that they have to not go back to their dorm or wherever they're living on campus and deal with it. And we always say, if there's any retaliation, you tell us. But I think sometimes even parents will say to me, okay, so now what? Like, why isn't the school calling? And why don't they want to settle? And why don't they want to do this? And I've spoken to many a Jewish parent who wants to know, why is this not happening? Why is that not happening?
Well, once you sort of organize yourself emotionally and logistically to come to such a place, you really want a resolution. I'm sure it's like end the distress, but it is prolonged. I understand that.
It is prolonged. And you think to yourself, this could take their whole time while they're in school. These are not fast. And I think now, because there's been so many public things in this recent administration with Columbia and people are seeing things that they feel like, I should be having this at my school. Why isn't their attention being focused here?
So you were, I'm going to use your word, you were obsessed. And maybe the better word is preoccupied, distressed, all these different things. Prior to 10 years ago. And then October 7th happens. Where were you? What do you remember about the day and its impact on you? And how was your recovery from it?
At the time, my mother was in the hospital. My mother had gotten COVID in 2022. And she was in the hospital and they had intubated her and she had been taken off the ventilator only like a few days before. So she was coming back to herself. And I'll always remember that I spoke to her that morning and she said, oh, Deena, I can't believe this. I can't believe what's happening. It's going to be awful on campuses for students. I can't believe what I'm watching.
She said that as she was watching what happened
she
in
called
Israel?
me. Yeah. And we watched it unfold. We were switching channels and watching it play out. And I guess at the time, I never thought that the reaction was going to be what the reaction was, because Israel was attacked and there were so many atrocities, right? And I was just thinking of all the people I knew in Israel, and, my mother's best friend who's a Sabra herself, and I called her to see how she was doing. And I remember she said to me, it doesn't matter that I'm Israeli, Deena. We are all Israel. Like, I'm Yisrael Chai. We all have a connection as Jews to this. This is personal for all of us. What surprised me was that I was getting emails by Sunday of some of the reactions on college campuses from professors saying that they rejoiced, that it was a day of jubilation for them, and thinking to myself, I must be in some sort of alternate reality where people say this, people put this out on their X accounts or Twitter or whatever we want to call it. And that's when I had a taste that as bad as the atrocities were, and they were awful, and the hostages, that there was going to be a wave on campuses if people were putting out these kinds of awful statements. Professors, you always look to a professor when you're a student as somebody in a position of authority. And I've admired so many of my professors. And it was pretty quick after that. Our inboxes filled up. And I remember on one of our case agendas, we would put all the different schools, and it was just like Hamas, 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 because we were just overrun. I remember the surprise on so many Jewish students' faces. Like, they were supportive after George Floyd. They were supportive to other groups. They were supportive after Ukraine. Well, why isn't there any support being given to me? I have family in Israel. Like, why isn't there any outreach from the university? Why isn't there any statement? Why are they all of a sudden neutral on this? These students had a similar awakening that I had in 2013, where they got a larger view of what was out there. There were students who really became active at that point in Jewish life because they felt, how did I miss this? How did I not know this was all happening? And it has been obviously an incredibly trying time. I mean, I've seen like all the documentaries that come out, and I'm like, I lived that. That's what it was for us, for me. And the reason I go back to the Israeli student American was that he was popular before October 7th. He didn't change. The school changed their perception of him after an atrocity. He had lost people. He had to go to funerals remotely, and there was no showing of compassion for him. And I can't think of any other nationality that we've ever treated this way.
I interviewed the former president of the Roman Jewish community, and she has given lots of interviews, and people often say to her, why is there anti-Semitism? And she says, why are you asking me that question? I'm not the expert. If you want to take a gander, then you don't need to. Why do you think that this is so virulent, just constantly waiting at the surface to boil over?
One of my colleagues at the time said to me, the masks have come off. Everybody was always saying, no, we don't hate Israel. We just wish it would give up some of its land. Like, we're just criticizing the political climate. But the masks came off October 7th, and that's not what they were saying. They were saying from the river to the sea. They were saying Palestine will be free of Jews. They were being very explicit about that. I see this as today's manifestation of anti-Semitism. It always changes and it warps, and there's always a reason. We went from people 10 years ago being maybe more polite about it, in the sense of like, no, I'm not an anti-Semite. No, I love my Jewish friends. No, I respect them. I just have problems with the politics of Israel. And that's why I support things like BDS, to being like, no, I want to see the end of Israel. I will hold it against those Jewish people who don't disavow. And there are, I'm sure you know, those Jews who do. And when I would find these students call their parents and be like, do you know what your kids are doing at school? But I see a lot of it as just the scapegoating, just another form of it. I know throughout history, Jews have been blamed for all of society's ills, and I just see this as another one. When I went to school, it was free Tibet, and everybody was about Tibet, but nobody went after, and nor should they, anybody who was Asian on campus and said, like, look what China is doing. Like, nobody blamed them. We just wanted a free Tibet, and we supported the Dalai Lama. But this is so different because, like, the people who support Israel are blamed. You're supposed to take a position in order to belong to a group. And I have Jewish students tell me how progressive they are and how liberal they are and how all these groups, if they want to be a part of it, they have to disavow part of themselves. That's part of what stuck out to me from the Brandeis Center when I would read statements. I thought nobody else has to pay such a high price to be accepted. And those people who are strong enough to stand up to it find themselves alienated and isolated. And it's not just students. I see this happen to professors. I see this happen to deans of schools. Like, they're at a California liberal school And they've always had these friends, and now they're not their friends anymore. And what was the precipitating event? October 7th. First, they were upset that none of their friends reached out to them to support. And then they were upset because their friends started actually attacking Israel for defending itself and attacking them for supporting Israel. I'm not sure what to make of it. I just want them to know that there are people who stand with them and they don't stand alone.
I think one of the hard things is that if you choose to stand up about this issue, it becomes your whole identity. People also want to be musicians, as the Israeli student was at American University, and want to have a multiplicity of identities. And this clouds that, which also feels very unfair.
It does feel unfair. I agree with you. And people should have pride in their homeland and in their ethnicity, and they shouldn't have to hide that. But I agree, it shouldn't be everything, and it shouldn't be the primary topic of conversation for everything. They have made other topics become part of this. So I'll have a student who's like, I'm a med student, and I don't understand why we're discussing this in my class. It has nothing to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't understand why this is the writing assignment. I had a student who was taking French, and they had to write about the genocide in Palestine in French. And I thought, well, first of all, it's a really advanced class if you guys could write an essay. But I thought, wow, like you can't even go to French and be left alone. Why does this even get into it?
Yeah, I was aware of a high school student where this subject came up in algebra. And what was so interesting was she said, well, my mother is a Russian Jew and my father is Moroccan. And the teacher said something like, how difficult it must be for them to navigate this cultural tension. And she said, no, my Moroccan father is Jewish. And the teacher did not believe her.
It's so pervasive that we have a task force within the Brandeis Center on anti-Semitism in healthcare. And we meet every 2 weeks. And there's anti-Semitism at the American Psychological Association. I mean, Richie Torres wrote a letter, and I speak to psychologists who are dealing with it. There's a decolonization therapy, which is literally, obviously not in the DSM, but basically makes Zionism a disease. And somebody even had a slide in one of their presentations where they had a brain and they showed like the disease center as Zionism. So I feel like it's pervasive through all parts of society. I couldn't even enjoy the Superman film because they were making reference to the conflict. And I thought, Superman had a Jewish creator. This should be my time to not think about this. And I'm angry watching this film.
Now, let me ask you, you went to UPenn, you did your other degrees at Northwestern. I mean, you know, you've been at some of those premium institutions, and now those institutions seem like the ones that really dominate the conversation about unfairness, bigotry, anti-Semitism. How do you feel towards the institutions that gave you such a rich education in light of how things have developed?
I feel anger. I feel betrayal. But I want to say that my parents are both CUNY graduates. My dad went to Brooklyn College. My mother went to Hunter. And they are of the worst, the CUNYs in anti-Semitism. I mean, when my parents went, it was like the heyday where it was a free education. They were the first in their families to go to college. They were amongst other Jewish students. And it's a totally different world. It's not just the elite institutions, which of course have always had their issues. Columbia had where they set the number of Jewish students that they would take in. And I had actually met a doctor years ago who was able to get in while they were trying to not take Jewish medical students at Columbia. And I felt like, at least during my era, we had come full forward, right? Penn had one of the highest numbers of Jews at any of the Ivies, and it was a Jewish-friendly Ivy. It was known for that. And there have been articles like, where are we supposed to go? Where is it good for us? I've had Jewish students leave the schools and go to schools in Israel, even during the war, saying, I feel more comfortable here.
You have your work cut out for you, and you're really passionate about it. As I learned, you have very limited time. So I really want to thank you for sitting down with me and having this discussion. And I hope people will recognize that these resources are out there and avail themselves of them should they need.
Thank you. Thank you for your time today, too.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to What Came After wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us online at whatcameafter.com.
חזרתי היום על כל המילים שכתבנו אז, כשלא ידענו כלום ולא ידענו כלום. וזה מביך, זה מצחיק גם אולי, איך שדברים קורים מעצמם, איך מה שהולך רק הולך ממה שנשאר. אני יכולה לכתוב שירים לנצח בשקט שלי לבד, בשקט שלי לבד, אבל עצוב לי מאוד חזרתי היום על כל המילים שכתבנו אז, כשכבר ידענו הכל ולא רצינו לראות. עכשיו אני כאן לא בשביל שום דבר, אין לי אורחים, אין אדם מיותר בחדר, וגם לא אדם רצוי מאוד. אני מוצאת את עצמי חושבת, אולי זה עדיף שאין הפרעות בסדר, גם אם אין אדם רצוי מאוד.